He writes regularly for The Guardian, New Statesman, Counterpunch, Morning Star and many others, but he's also a regular contributor on Russia Today. Okay, Dan Glazebrook.
I should probably just clarify, I'm not a regular contributor to The Guardian. I have my first, and I suspect last piece published in Guardian Online a few months ago. But yeah, we'll watch that space, we'll see. I've got kind of two possible talks here. There's one that I planned to do, which was entitled Human Rights, the New White Man's Burden, talking about how human rights have become a kind of the new civilizing mission, you know, to justify 20th, 21st century imperialism. But I suspect you're well aware of all of that, and especially after the sort of lambasting for that whole approach from the last couple of speakers. I was thinking of actually, I might just talk a little bit about the more recent events, with especially some of the questions focused on that, about what's happening in Mali, what's happening in the Maghreb and the Middle East, and this whole latest wave of war that's underway. So I don't know if we should do a little straw poll or yeah, okay. All right, okay. So, well, maybe I'll do it. We'll see how long it takes me to do this. But people asked some questions about Al Qaeda in the Maghreb, and you know, Cameron's been saying this is a serious threat. We're going to have to be there now militarily across 6 countries for decades, which was interesting because it was a couple of days after Francois Hollande said, "Oh, we'll probably be in and out in weeks." But this idea of an existential threat, yeah, it's clearly nonsense. The government themselves estimate Al Qaeda in Maghreb to have a membership of between 250 and 400 people. I mean, I know this whole concept of membership for something that's not an organization is bizarre anyway, but if this is the government itself saying this, well, France have already said we've killed hundreds of them already. Well, there were only maximum 400 to begin with, so how can it take you a number of decades to wipe them all out? Well, of course it can, because as soon as you go in, you create hundreds more. And you give a little boost of credibility to the flagging kind of credibility of some of the Salafi militias that have been clearly exposed as tools of the West, in Libya and Syria at least, over recent years. They've now got their credibility back as the anti-Western freedom fighters and so on that they may have lost. I want to go back though to fully understand what's happening here. And we have to see this in the whole context of the West's economic decline. The West has a big problem in Africa. It's relied on Africa, on the exploitation of African labor and resources for its own prosperity for hundreds of years, you know, going back to slavery. You've got the classic study by Eric Williams of Capitalism and Slavery, showing in great detail how the capital that laid the basis of the Industrial Revolution in this country was created through slavery and the slave trade and the profits from plantation slavery going through the 19th century, and the exploitation of resources in things like palm oil, again, was particularly crucial as an industrial lubricant to industrialization, and so on. And it's on into so-called post-colonial, or more accurately, neo-colonial times, when you had a system set up where the West, you know, has basically managed to, well, not in every case, with greater or lesser degree of success from one country to another, set up a system of proxy governments who are happy to hand over resources dirt cheap, keep their countries underdeveloped in exchange for, you know, a healthy share of the loot. People like Mobutu in the Congo, who ruled with an iron fist for 40 years and, you know, squandered lots of the money that he was given from the multinationals who were allowed to plunder the country. Now this whole system, like I say, with various variations from slavery through colonialism through neo-colonialism, has allowed the West to plunder the resources of Africa for hundreds of years, and has been the basis, and continues to be the basis, along with the plunder of Latin America and Asia, of prosperity in the West. And that whole system is facing a deep crisis at the moment. They're increasingly unable to run that system anymore. They're increasingly unable to rely solely on financial manipulation, bribery, economic blackmail, and so on, to keep that system going. Is the two big challenges facing the West in Africa. They're twofold. The first one is China. Now, like I say, when the West is going through a period of economic crisis, and then you have countries like China coming along and offering countries like the Congo, for example, recent Congo deal China offered the Congo a $9 billion virtually no interest loan, very, very low interest loan, which was going to, this is what's unique about China's business in Africa compared to the way the West do business, is no money changes hands. So when China offered this $9 billion loan, they don't actually put $9 billion into, the Congolese government bank account, which is the way the West classically did it with people like Mobutu, is, a country would lend money to, say, Mobutu, the Congolese president, in the morning, and then in the afternoon, Mobutu would pay that money straight back into the same bank, only in his private bank account, and the Congo would still owe the debt. Like, the money was still in the bank, it had only been out for a few hours, but now the Congo is left with the debt. So by dealing with cash and numbers on a screen, the West was able to set up this whole debt extortion mechanism where countries will lend money. That money was then siphoned off by corrupt government officials, often put into power by the West, leaving the country saddled with a massive debt and an unpayable interest rate. The interest on African loans now is in the, I forget the figures, because I wasn't planning to do this talk. I didn't have the figures. I know it's in the tens of billions. I think it's 20 billion a year, something like that, in terms of debt interest on loans, like I said, that were often fraudulent. In fact, there's a really good book come out recently called Africa's Odious Debts that I'd recommend having a look at. That goes into great detail in how these loans were often essentially fraudulent. It reckons out of every dollar that was lent to Africa in the last 30 years, 80 cents in each dollar was out of the country within a year. Like I say, often in the private bank accounts of corrupt officials. So the way China does the business is very different. That $9 billion that China is going to lend to the Congo is not going to be in the form of money, it's going to be in the form of infrastructure. Hospitals, roads, railways, health centres, housing, and so on. And this, there's an interesting analyst, Deborah Brautigam, who's done a whole study on China's relationship with Africa, and her conclusion is that for the first time, the way China's doing business may allow African resources actually to be used to develop Africa, rather than just being a curse. And this is a fundamental challenge. If China's offering this kind of deal, then the West, in a state of stagnation and recession and depression, can't compete with that. They just can't. The mining companies can't compete with those kind of deals that China are offering. So that's one big threat to the West's siphoning off and extortion of Africa. The other big threat is the African Union, set up in 2002. And the African Union, especially the financial institutions of the African Union, you've got there's three that have been proposed and that are being developed as we speak. The African Investment Bank, African Central Bank, the idea of which is to actually issue a single African currency, and the African Monetary Fund. An African Monetary Fund is clearly, you can see by the name, a direct competitor of what's called the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund has been able to bleed Africa for decades with a fund of just $25 billion that it lends and then, either ramps up interest or demands things like wholesale privatization in exchange for the loan, as conditions of the loan, or demands things like ending tariff, which destroys the kind of burgeoning industry of a country. So the IMF has been able to do all this for $25 billion. The African Monetary Fund, which only African countries are allowed to contribute to, there's no Western banks allowed to get involved, or Chinese banks, or any other banks, already has had a commitment from various African countries of $42 billion as a startup fund. So that could completely destroy IMF influence on the continent. It could be just over. Unfortunately, $10 billion of that was committed by Libya. In fact, Libya had committed $30 billion to the 3 of these financial institutions, which were seized by Obama. They've been seized now. So they won't be going into that. But Algeria has committed 16 billion to this, and that's still there on the table. African Monetary Fund is supposed to be going ahead soon. So these are 2 huge challenges. African Union, obviously as a basic principle as well, unity, more unified Africa will make it harder to exploit. But these specific financial aspects in particular are going to make it much more hard for the Western elites to exploit it in the way they have been for hundreds of years. Business with China is having the same effect. So, what's the reaction of all of this has been a military one. Unable to use just financial manipulation, economic blackmail, falling back increasingly on using military means to continue this plunder and exploitation. Now, the problem for the militarism, so this is the context in which we have AFRICOM set up, for example, by the USA, set up just a couple of years ago. It became operational, I think, in 2008, although the genesis of it goes back to a document in, I think, 2002 by something called the African Oil Policy Group, something like that, a US congressional committee with various military leaders, oil industry insiders, and congressmen that explained that African oil was going to become much more important over the coming decades, and recommended increasing US military presence on the continent to facilitate that. So the problem for AFRICOM was that no African country wanted to host it. So in 2007, George Bush, when he announced the creation of AFRICOM, which stands for African Command, the US military command center for conducting missions in Africa, he announced it and he said, we're looking for an African country to host it. Ever since then, there have been denials because they couldn't find a single African country willing to host a US base for AFRICOM. There's a very small US base in Djibouti, there's a couple of other small ones in West Africa, but as for a full operational HQ base, no African country was willing to host it. And they had to very humiliatingly set up in Stuttgart, Germany, it's as close as they could get, which is where it's still based. And ever since, US officials have said, oh yeah, we never wanted it to be in Africa. But you can look back on the record, it's in Bush's first speech.